Thank you, Julian. So the human brain is possibly the most complex structure in the universe that we know of. And this structure is made up of billions of neural pathways connecting and relaying messages back and forth between multiple substructures. And these neural connections are what allow us to move, think, and feel as we do. So during development, when we're babies, every time we learn a new behavior, a new neural pathway is carved out in the brain. And the more we repeat that behavior, the stronger that neural connection becomes. So every time you think in a certain way, practice a certain task, or feel a certain emotion, the neural pathways used to carry out that behavior is strengthened. And by the time you've reached adulthood, your brain has built up a large repertoire of mastered skills and abilities that you can perform more easily from memory. So it's like when you go to work or school in the morning, you get the bus or take your car, and after taking the same route for a certain amount of time, it becomes second nature. You don't think about getting to where you want to go to, you just do it. But if your route were to be disrupted, for example, because of a traffic accident or scaffolding falling from a construction site, you would have to find an alternative route to get to where you want to go to. In other words, you would have to update your route based on changes in your environment. And this is what your brain is doing. It's constantly updating and changing its connectivity and responsiveness based on changes in your surrounding environment. And this is neuroplasticity. In other words, your brain's ability to be flexible and reorganize itself. And it's all about the selective representation of things that are important to your brain. It's what you're paying attention to. It's what's rewarding you. It's what your brain is regarding as positive and important to you. So, to give an example of neuroplasticity, I want to focus on one area of the brain in particular, and that is the somatosensory cortex. And this is the part of the brain that is responsible for processing all sensory input from the body. So, the way in which this works is, say you felt a sensation, such as this is the somatosensory cortex from face view. So say you felt a sensation such as heat or cold or pain in your hand, for example. Receptors in your hand would detect the change and convert that energy into electrical signals. And these electrical signals would be passed to the central nervous system, passing through several structures, through one of several different neural pathways, until eventually reaching the somatosensory cortex. And within the sensory cortex, there is the homunculus, which is a neurological map of all the different representations in the body. And within this map, there are receptive fields which trigger the firing of specific neurons. So the more sensitive an area of your body is, the more fine-grained its representation will be in the cortex. For example, there are many densely packed receptor fields in the area representing the hand, and this is what allows your fingers to detect fine details and carry out fine movements, such as writing with a pen or tying your shoelace. And on the other hand, in the area representing the leg, there are fewer larger receptor fields which can detect change over a wider area, but with less precision. And this is a picture of what we would look like if our body parts were proportionate to their representations in the cortex. So we'd have massive hands, we'd have tiny bodies, and we'd just be really ugly. How hardwired are these representations? In other words, how plastic or flexible is the sensory cortex? So neuroplasticity can occur for multiple reasons, and it can function in multiple ways. As I mentioned before, it's constantly changing itself based on experience. And this could be to aid the learning of a new skill, but it could also be to compensate for a loss of function in the body. And within this, it can function by reorganizing the brain structure or by forming new neural pathways so it can carry out its necessary functions. So we're looking at how plasticity can occur in the sensory cortex in response to injury. This is a phenomenon that has been investigated by looking at body representations after amputation. So once major input is lost from the body, say for example from your arm, what happens to the area of the brain that represented that missing part. And this was largely investigated by Dr. Ramachandran, who is kind of the founding father of plasticity research. And in one study in particular, he found that when he poked the cheek of an amputee with a cotton swab while the amputee had his eyes closed, the patient reported feeling it on both his cheek and the back of his missing hand. And when he poked the patient's nostril, the patient could feel it in his nostril and the little finger of his missing hand. And this was thought to be because of a reorganization in the cortex. So if you look at the topographic organization of the sensory cortex, you'll see that the area closest to the hand representation is the face representation. So what Ramachandran thought happened was once there was a loss of input from the hand, the area representing the face had taken over the missing part. And because of this, touching the face activated cells in both areas, and there was sensory output coming from the two. But more recent research by Dr. McKean suggests that the representations within the cortex are relatively stable and, and the different areas are not responsible for their specific body parts, but more so for just carrying out their functions. So it's not about how the brain is structured, but more so how these structures communicate with each other via their respective neural pathways. So after amputation, instead of there being a reorganization in the brain and a new representation being created of the face, there is a development of new neural pathways. So the part of the brain that used to send signals from the hand are now being formed and sending signals from the face. And this might be why the patient was feeling sensations from his hand and his face, because the sensory cortex was receiving input from both of them via these new neural pathways. And with this approach, researchers have tried to recreate the neural pathways between the hand and the cortex. So if you look at the model of how sensory information is brought from the hand to the sensory system, after amputation, that neural connection is lost. But through a combination of science and engineering, a team of researchers were able to recreate that neural pathway through a robotic hand, which sends signals to electrodes implanted in the brain. And from this, a man who was paralyzed from the chest down was able to feel sensations with a robotic hand. And although the sensations were not the same as if he would be feeling with his natural hand, the connection was still there. And further research into how the brain encodes and responds to sensory information could contribute towards the development of more advanced prostheses. So with time, maybe amputees and paraplegics could view a robotic limb as an extension of themselves, which is really cool. And that's just an example of plasticity in the sensory cortex. But most areas of the brain are plastic. And the more we understand about how it functions, the more we may be able to utilize it. And this could have massive implications for the development of various rehabilitation techniques for various research concerns. For example, it could help us to understand more about recovery after stroke or recovery from neurological disorders such as Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's or depression. It could help to slow down the deterioration of an aging brain. It could help to make blind people see again. It could help to make deaf people hear again. It could even make ignorant people intelligent. Maybe, I don't know about that. But it's an incredibly exciting time for neuroscientific research, and I'm grateful for being given the opportunity to share some of that excitement with you today. Thank you very much.